Do you feel you're at a disadvantage without having a spouse by being a bachelor, which is pretty rare in U.S. politics?
Yeah, I think I'd be the first bachelor in 100 years. I think America is ready for this. If I'm qualified to lead the nation.
He spent 4 decades standing in front of cameras, arguing on Senate floors, and shaping some of the biggest foreign policy fights in modern American history. But the moment that truly defined Lindsey Graham happened decades before any of that, in a single room behind a small-town bar, when a 22-year-old college student became, almost overnight, the only parent his teenage sister had left. That is the story people are searching for now. Not the debates. Not the headlines. The real one. Lindsey Graham died on the night of July 11, 2026, at the age of 71, after what his office described as a brief and sudden illness. He passed away just 2 days after his birthday, and only a day after returning from Kiev, where he had met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to discuss military aid and the ongoing war with Russia. Tributes poured in almost immediately, from presidents, from foreign leaders, from political allies and rivals alike. But underneath the flood of official statements was a quieter story, one that had shaped Graham long before he ever ran for office, and one that explains, more than any speech ever could, who he really was. To understand that story, you have to go back to Central, South Carolina, a small town in the upstate part of the state, where Graham was born on July 9, 1955. His parents, Florence James Graham, known locally as FJ or the Dude, and Millie Walters Graham, were not wealthy people. They ran a business on Main Street called the Sanitary Cafe, a combination restaurant, bar, pool hall, and liquor store that served the town's mill workers after their shifts. For a while, the Graham family didn't just work above that business. They lived in a single room behind it. One room, where the whole family slept, ate, and watched television, with a metal tub used for bathing. Later they moved into a trailer, and eventually into a house next door to the business itself. By the time he was a child, Graham was already part of the family operation. He has said that by age 12 he was running the pool hall, answering phones, and hearing every story a small southern town had to offer. It was not an easy childhood by any conventional measure, but Graham would later describe it as formative, a place that taught him about people, about hard work, and about responsibility long before he needed any of those lessons for himself. That need arrived faster than anyone expected. Graham was the first person in his family to attend college, enrolling at the University of South Carolina and joining the Reserve Officers Training Corps. He was 21 years old when his mother, Millie, was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma. She died at the age of 52. 15 months later, his father suffered a fatal heart attack. He was 69. In the span of just over a year, Graham went from being a college student worrying about exams to being the only guardian his 13-year-old sister, Darlene, had left in the world. It's worth pausing on that timeline, because it is easy to say quickly and hard to actually absorb. 2 parents. 15 months apart. One 21-year-old son suddenly responsible for a little sister who had just watched her entire family disappear. Darlene later described the moment their father died, saying she was the one who found him when she tried to wake him for school. She has spoken about how frightened she was, standing in the living room of their home, and how her older brother wrapped his arms around her and made her a promise, that he would always be there, and that he would always take care of her. He kept that promise in ways that reshaped the rest of his life. Rather than transferring somewhere else or letting relatives take over full-time, Graham stayed close to home. He returned to Central nearly every weekend during college to check on his sister, who was living with an aunt and uncle nearby, making sure she got to school, kept her curfew, and had some version of stability in a life that had just been upended. Friends from that period have said the toll was visible. The family's small business, which had depended on his labor, began to struggle because he could no longer be there full-time. Eventually, he made the decision to sell the Sanitary Cafe altogether. After finishing his degree, Graham joined the United States Air Force as a JAG officer, a military lawyer. It was a practical decision as much as a patriotic one. Joining the service meant he could formally take on Darlene as his legal dependent, which allowed her to receive his military health and insurance benefits. He went further than that, though. Graham legally adopted his younger sister, not to replace their parents, but to make sure that if anything ever happened to him, she would still be protected. For a young officer in his 20s, still building a career and a life of his own, that was not a small commitment. It was a declaration that his family, however small it had become, still came first. Graham's military career took him to Rhein-Main Air Base in Frankfurt, Germany, where he served as the Air Force's chief prosecutor in Europe in the mid-1980s. He built a reputation as a sharp, fast-talking attorney, the kind of person who could hold a courtroom's attention without notes. When he returned to South Carolina at the end of the decade, he moved into local government and private law practice, serving as an assistant county attorney and later as city attorney for his hometown of Central. It was a modest, small-town start for someone who would go on to become one of the most recognizable senators in the country. His military service left a mark on him long before politics did. While defending an Air Force pilot accused of drug use in the mid-1980s, Graham was featured in an episode of 60 Minutes that exposed flaws in the Air Force's drug testing procedures, an early example of the courtroom instincts and comfort in front of cameras that would later define his political career. Colleagues from that period remember him as fast-talking, sharp, and unusually good at reading a room, whether that room was a military courtroom in Germany or, decades later, a Senate hearing room in Washington. His political rise from there was steady rather than explosive. He won a seat in the South Carolina House of Representatives in 1992. 2 years later, he made history by becoming the first Republican elected to represent South Carolina's 3rd congressional district since the post-Civil War era of Reconstruction. In 2002, when longtime Senator Strom Thurmond retired, Graham ran for the seat and won with more than half the vote. He would go on to win re-election in 2008, 2014, and 2020, building a career that spanned more than 2 decades in the United States Senate. He chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee, chaired the Senate Budget Committee, and became one of the chamber's most vocal and consistent advocates for an assertive American role in world affairs. Inside the Judiciary Committee, Graham became known for some of the most memorable and most combative moments of his Senate career. During the 2018 confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, Graham delivered a fiery, widely replayed speech defending the nominee against sexual assault allegations, a moment that instantly became one of the defining clips of his career and cemented his reputation, for supporters and critics alike, as someone willing to fight loudly for the causes and people he believed in. He also spent years working across party lines on immigration policy, joining a bipartisan group of senators nicknamed the Gang of Eight that tried, unsuccessfully, to pass comprehensive immigration reform in 2013. He returned to the issue repeatedly over the following decade, an effort that rarely succeeded but that colleagues on both sides of the aisle described as sincere. In 2017, he co-sponsored a healthcare overhaul known as the Graham-Cassidy Bill, an attempt to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act that ultimately failed to reach a vote. Graham became known, above almost anything else, as a foreign policy hawk. He pushed hard for military intervention when he believed American interests were at stake, argued for continued support of Ukraine as it fought off a Russian invasion, and remained one of Congress's most outspoken voices in favor of a hard line against Iran. Earlier in his career, he found close allies in that worldview in Senators John McCain and Joe Lieberman, a trio so tightly aligned on foreign policy that they were nicknamed the Three Amigos, traveling together and appearing together at press conferences from Kabul to Kiev. McCain, in particular, became something close to a mentor and older brother figure for Graham inside the Senate, and the two men's friendship was widely regarded as one of the closest personal bonds in a chamber not usually known for them. When McCain died in 2018, Graham spoke about the loss in deeply personal terms, describing a friendship that had shaped his entire approach to public service. In many ways, Graham spent the years after McCain's death carrying forward the same worldview the two men had built together, continuing to push for a muscular American role in conflicts from Afghanistan to Ukraine long after his friend and mentor was gone. His relationship with Donald Trump followed a more complicated arc. During the 2016 presidential race, in which Graham briefly ran for the Republican nomination himself, he was one of Trump's sharpest critics inside the party. That changed after Trump won the White House. The two men built what many described as a genuine working relationship, and Graham became one of Trump's most reliable allies in the Senate, someone the former president referred to as a close friend and, according to Graham himself, someone who considered him a foreign policy North Star. For all of that public history, though, the personal side of Graham's story stayed remarkably consistent from his 20s until the day he died. He never married, and he never had children of his own. It's a fact that made him unusual among senior senators, and it's one that Graham never tried especially hard to hide or dress up. In his own memoir, published in 2015, he wrote about it directly. "I've never married. I guess I attribute that to timing, too," he wrote. "The opportunity never presented itself at the right time, or I never found time to meet the right girl, or the right girl was smart enough not to have time for me. I haven't been lucky that way." It's a self-deprecating line, delivered with the kind of dry humor Graham was known for on the campaign trail, but it also reflects something true about the shape his adult life took. He came close to marriage only once, according to that same memoir, while stationed in Europe with the Air Force in the 1980s, when he considered proposing to a woman he was dating, a flight attendant for Lufthansa. He never did. His bachelorhood became something of a running joke during his short-lived 2016 presidential campaign, and more often than not, Graham was the one telling it. He joked publicly that if he were elected president, he would need a rotating first lady, since he didn't have one lined up. Over the years, his unmarried status also drew persistent rumors and speculation about his personal life, including repeated claims that he was gay, something Graham addressed directly and denied on more than one occasion when the subject was raised publicly. He generally treated the scrutiny with the same wry humor he brought to most difficult topics, but he also made clear, repeatedly, that speculation about his private life was not something he considered anyone else's business. What Graham did say, consistently and without hesitation, was that despite never marrying, he did not consider himself a man without a family. His family was his sister. Dolene Graham nor Dunn remained the central relationship of his adult life from the moment their parents died until the day he did. She largely stayed out of the political spotlight over the years, raising her own family away from cameras in South Carolina, but she did step forward at key moments in her brother's career. In June 2015, she introduced him on the stage in Central, South Carolina, when he formally announced his campaign for president, just steps away from where the old Sanitary Cafe once stood. The day before that announcement, according to reporting at the time, Dolene walked into the old poolroom for the first time in roughly 3 decades and cried. On the way to the announcement itself, brother and sister reportedly stopped at their parents' graves together. Dolene spoke about her brother in interviews over the years with a kind of clarity that cut through the usual political talking points. "He's kind of like a brother, a father, and a mother rolled into one," she once said. In another interview, describing the emotional weight of everything he had taken on for her, she said simply, "I've always had him, but who did he have? Breaks my heart." It's a striking thing for a sibling to say about someone widely regarded as one of the most powerful people in Washington. Not admiration for his committee chairmanships or his foreign policy instincts, but a kind of protective worry about whether the person who had given up so much to raise her had ever gotten enough in return. Over the decades, Dolene built her own life in South Carolina, raising a family of her own, nieces and nephews who largely grew up away from the spotlight their uncle lived under. She appeared occasionally at campaign events, stood beside him at his 2015 presidential announcement, and in a 2014 campaign ad recalled a much simpler version of the same devotion. "I have always looked up to Lindsey. He's just always been there for me as long as I can remember. If I fell down and scraped my knee, Lindsey was the one I ran to." That image, of a young girl running to her older brother instead of a parent, is really the starting point for everything that came after. It explains why, even as Graham became one of the most quoted and most recognizable senators in the country, friends and biographers kept returning to the same conclusion: that the defining relationship of his life had been settled decades before he ever won an election, in a small house next to a bar in Central, South Carolina. That question, whether Graham himself had enough, is one that reporters and biographers circled for years without ever landing on a tidy answer, and it's not the job of anyone telling this story now to invent one. What is documented, clearly and consistently, across decades of interviews, is a pattern. A man who built an entire public career around service, first to his sister, then to his constituents, then to a set of foreign policy causes he believed mattered more than his own comfort. Friends and colleagues who knew him for decades have said that early loss shaped both his personality and his politics. The same instinct that made him drive home every weekend from college to check on a scared 13-year-old later showing up as the instinct that made him push, sometimes against his own party, for causes like immigration reform or continued aid to Ukraine, positions he held even when they cost him politically. In the final stretch of his life, Graham was still working at the pace that had defined his entire career. He had just won the Republican Senate primary in South Carolina in June 2026 and was widely expected to cruise to a 5th term in November. Only a day before his death, he was overseas in Kiev, meeting with President Zelensky to discuss military assistance and sanctions legislation he had spent more than a year pushing through Congress alongside Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal. By all accounts from those closest to him, there was no warning sign. A senior staffer told reporters there was no indication he wasn't feeling well in the days before his death. President Trump, who spoke with Graham by phone the night he died, said afterward that other than seeming tired, he was fine. Emergency responders were called to Graham's home on Capitol Hill on the evening of Saturday, July 11th, for a report of cardiac arrest. Paramedics attempted CPR at the scene. He was 71 years old. His office confirmed his death in the early hours of the following morning, asking, in a short statement, for privacy for his family during what they called an incredibly difficult period. The tributes that followed came from across the political spectrum, a reflection of just how long Graham had been a fixture in Washington and how wide his relationship stretched, even with people who disagreed with him. Trump called him one of the greatest people and senators I have ever known, and a true American patriot. Foreign governments, including Israel's Ministry of Defense, issued statements mourning a man who had stood as one of their staunchest allies in Congress for more than 20 years. Senate colleagues who had clashed with him on the floor for years offered their condolences, and Democratic Senator Jeanne Shaheen suggested that the most fitting tribute to his legacy would be for Congress to finally pass the Ukraine-related legislation he had championed for so long. Graham's death also set off an immediate scramble over what would come next, both in the Senate and in South Carolina politics. Under state law, Republican Governor Henry McMaster was tasked with appointing a temporary replacement to serve out the remainder of Graham's term, while a special primary was scheduled for August to determine who would appear on the November ballot in what had been expected to be a comfortable re-election campaign for Graham himself, since he had just won his own primary the previous month. Names began circulating almost immediately, from members of South Carolina's congressional delegation to statewide officials, and Trump himself said publicly that he already had a preferred successor in mind, though he declined to share who out of respect for the timing. For a state that had sent Graham to Washington for more than 2 decades, the sudden need to find a replacement was its own kind of tribute, a reminder of just how large a footprint one senator from a small upstate town had left on South Carolina's political landscape. But it was Delene's presence, quiet and largely out of public view, that told the more complete version of who Lindsey Graham actually was. He was, by any measure, one of the more consequential senators of his generation, a chairman, a deal maker, a hawk whose voice on foreign policy shaped debates from Baghdad to Kiev to Jerusalem. He built that career from almost nothing, the son of 2 high school dropouts running a bar and pool hall in a small southern mill town. And he built it while never losing sight of the promise he made as a 22-year-old, standing in a living room with a frightened 13-year-old sister in his arms, that no matter what happened, they would get through it together. He kept that promise for nearly 50 years. In the end, that quiet, private commitment, made long before he ever set foot in Washington, may say more about the man than any of the headlines from his decades in the Senate ever could. Lindsey Graham spent his public life fighting for causes far from home, standing in front of cameras in Kiev, in Baghdad, in Senate hearing rooms where the whole country was watching. But the truest measure of him was set at home, in a small South Carolina town, well before anyone knew his name, before the committee chairmanships, before the presidential campaign, before he was ever the man millions of Americans saw on their television screens. It is worth remembering, too, that Graham never asked anyone to feel sorry for the life he chose. He spoke about his sister with pride, not regret, and he treated the responsibility he took on at 22 not as a burden that derailed his plans, but as the plan itself, the thing that shaped everything he did afterward, from law school to the Air Force to the Senate floor. When he talked about never marrying, he did it with a joke rather than a complaint. When he talked about his sister, the tone changed completely. That contrast, a man who could laugh off his own loneliness